Hello, my name is Peter Salziger, and I would like to welcome you to my small presentation about my movie Paranoia. I really hope you enjoyed the movie. Currently, I'm doing my Master of Science in Media Informatics in the University of Applied Science Gießen-Friedberg in Germany. The movie itself was shot during a project in my bachelor time last year. Here you can see my table of contents. First of all, I want to show you the hardware equipment I used, and I show you some pictures from the set, and I talk about the film editing software I used. But the main topics of my presentation are the two CG shots I made. The first CG shot with the people running on the street following the girl, and the second CG shot, the blood scene. Here is the hardware equipment I used. First of all, there's the camera, the JVC GY-H100, which is actually a quite good camera to shoot with. I decided to shoot in 720p with a frame rate of 24 frames per second. On the left side is the digital hard drive disc recorder, which stores the movie directly on the hard drive in a digital format. It's a great benefit to use this device because transferring the movie to the computer is saves much more time. On the right side at the bottom is a wide angle lens converter I used, and because I decided to output the movie in CinemaScope. CinemaScope is cinema aspect ratio of 2.35. And last but not least, the audio equipment we used is a quite good microphone from the German company called Sennheiser. Here are some pictures of the set. You see the camera installed on the tripod, and there is a battery pack and a hard disk recorder. And here you see I connected my laptop to the camera because I wanted to have a real-time preview on a big screen, because the LCD screen of the camera is quite small and it's very difficult to adjust the framing of the scene correctly. Here is the microphone, which is also installed on a tripod and which captures the conversation between the two persons sitting in the room. Here you see the scene in which the doctor decides to use the evil medicine. And on the set I was very lucky that there was enough place to fit the camera beside the wall, because there was not much place for the camera. The film editing software in order to cut the movie I used is the Avid Media Composer in version 3.5, and I stored the movie in a format called DNX HD19, which saves the movie in a bitrate of 90 megabits per second, causing the entire project getting very large. The whole movie took about more than 60 gigabytes. What you can see here is that during the cutting there are several layers. On the top is the so-called Cinemask, which crops the movie from 60 to 9 to CinemaScope format. And there is a film layer and a vocal layer and a soundtrack layer, because music is running all the time in the background of the movie. Now we come to the first CG shot. I'm sure you remember the scene where the girl is running away from many people following her Paranoia scene, and the first thing to do was footage stabilizing. First of all, I show you the source movie. Here you see that the camera movement is very shaky because I was sitting in the back of my car holding out the camera, and it was in addition very cold, and it was quite difficult to steady the cam to smoothen the movement, so I had to smooth the movement digitally. What I did is that I use an effect in Avid called the Fluid Motion Stabilizer, which makes the movement of the camera much more smooth and look professional. I was very happy to use that effect. Here is again the final result to bring you back in mind what I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes. The first thing to do is, how can I create so many people? The solution is to use a software called Massive. Massive is the software which is also used in movies like Lord of the Rings in order to create mass simulation. The second step is I try to figure out how to use Massive, because it's quite difficult. It's not very much user-friendly, and I began to make a small Photoshop compositing. I rendered out some people and tried to combine it into a real picture. The next step I did was rendering out a movie out of Massive and combine it with a real picture in Adobe After Effects. So there are really many people, and in the movie I decided not to use that amount of people. When you want to combine three-dimensional objects into a 2D movie, the first thing you have to do is to analyze the camera movement and the camera rotation. I use the software Match Mover 2010 from Autodesk in order to reconstruct the movement and the rotation of the real-world camera. What I need is a three-dimensional representation of the camera in a three-dimensional world. Here we have an insight in the software Massive. And what we see here is a reconstruction of the real world. We have a reconstruction of the street. It's the green surface, and the red point here is a representation of the real world camera, which actually moves and rotates the same I moved and rotates the camera in real world. And you can create some people running according to the direction of the cross. And what was really difficult was the scaling, because you have the scaling of the three-dimensional world has to be the same scaling like in the real world. And I have some test renderings for you to demonstrate how difficult it was to find the right scaling. In this example, you see that the people are too small and that the people are running wild around, and I didn't want to have them run in every direction, so I had to um, erase some moving informations from their brain. So when you go into the brain, you see some instructions like run left, run right, and I cutted them out. And so I get the people running straight on the street and not around where they want. This is also a very funny example. People are running straight the way I want, but they are really too big. And it took more than 10 test renderings to find out the real scaling. And what Massive renders out is a so-called alpha channel TIFF sequence, which means that every frame is stored in a single file, in a single TIFF file, and every frame has his alpha information, which makes me easily able to cut them onto the real movie. This is software Adobe After Effects, which I used in order to combine three-dimensional images with the original two-dimensional movie. You see two layers. On the top is the people layer, and I added some more realistic effects like shadow. So the people cast shadow onto the street, and I adjusted the color of the people, the so-called hue and saturation, in order to make it look like more realistic. Here again, you can have a look at the final result, and especially have a look at the shadows on the street. People are casting shadows, and it's somehow looks really wet, because the street was actually wet. And those things I created in After Effects. Okay, let's have a look at the second CG shot. Here first you can see the result shot, the final rendering, and the next steps I want to tell you how I created that effect. At the beginning I made some blood tests. I first created water-like effect, and I used the 3D software Maya 2010. And what you can see here is that the water calculation is based on very tiny balls bouncing around the room, and in the last step those balls are recalculated to a smoothed mesh. That smooth mesh looks like this one here, and it looks much more realistic than displaying tiny little balls. The next step was again to analyze the camera movement and its rotation, and I used Match Mover again, and here it was very important to reconstruct the whole scene. I prepared some test renderings to demonstrate you that fact. Here it's already calculated, the camera, and I placed some primitive geometry into the scene to evaluate the quality of the camera tracking. And you can see that it's very clean, that the geometry is moving correctly. The next step was to rebuild or reconstruct the whole geometry, and it was very important to rebuild the wall, the floor, the ceiling, so that the water is able to bounce off the walls correctly, because it has to know how to interact with its environment. Here is another test shot, including the blood effect. And it's very interesting to see how the bolts are being calculated with its environment. And it was really difficult to adjust those particles, because the calculating of the physics needs sometimes about an hour. So I had to wait an hour to get a result, and I find out that it doesn't look the way I want, and I had to adjust these settings and wait another hour. So I needed a few days to get the correct result. Here is a compositing of the whole scene in After Effects. You can see several layers. There is the blood layer rendered out of Maya, and I had to rotoscope the girl, which means I had to mask her out in order to get her in the front, because the water is actually in front of her, and it took very much time to mask her out by every single frame. But the result was actually quite good, I think, and it was worth the time working. Another effect which I didn't place into the movie was the so-called submerged effect. The difficulty of the scene is that the camera is moving through the floor, through the ceiling, in one fluid motion. And here again I used After Effects to simulate the movement of the camera. What you can see here is that I also reconstructed the scene into a three-dimensional world, and you see 3 red rectangles, and those rectangles are each representation of the basic primitives of the real world, like the 2 walls on the side and the ground. What I did then is I casted the 2D movie into the 3-dimensional room, and it's like casting shadow, but I casted the 2D movie into a 3-dimensional room. So by doing this, I can place a virtual camera, and that camera I am able to move the way I want. So I can move the virtual camera very, very close to the ground, and which I actually can't do in real world. And I can even move the camera through the ground until it reaches the next ceiling in the room downstairs. And this way I can do things what I can't do in real world. Well, that's actually the end of my presentation. I really hope you enjoyed it and maybe you learned something which would make me very happy. So, and yeah, I would like to thank you for your attention and see you.